one of the reasons that women don't ask for more or negotiate is because of fear or feeling like they would be seen as selfish or greedy or stubborn or difficult. And I remember thinking, well, that's their problem. Why should that hold me back? Who gives a shit what they think?
Well, Bhavana, welcome to Money Bites. Super excited to have you here.
Thanks, great to be here.
We have our resident questions. So, could we start off with a one liner of yourself?
I figure it out and get it done. How's that?
I love it. Doer. Just do it.
I am definitely a doer, and if I don't know how to do something within, I guess, reason, I will figure it out. So,
Love it. And what do you currently do?
so currently, I am the founder and CEO of Until There Are Nine, which is an organization that's there to actively help women achieve pay and promotion equity in the workplace. In addition to that, I am a mom. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I have two dogs. And I like to do lots of other things.
That is a full plate. I can't wait to dig more into up-leveling women. Before we go into that, the second resident question: what is a trivia about you that people don't know?
I feel like most people know pretty much everything about me in terms of what I like to do and who I am. I think the thing that people may find the most surprising, especially when I've been working with them for a while, or for people who don't, know me too well, is I love hip hop, R&B, and reggae. I think that's kind of like primarily what I listen to in the car. I'm a big fan of Biggie, and now my daughter is too. So I think that's people find kind of surprising. And that I have an obsession with donuts and ice cream. But I also love to make ice cream. And that was actually a business that I was considering a few years ago of actually launching my own ice cream brand. But I do love to make ice cream.
If you ever get it off the ground, yeah, I will be there first in line. Curious in the multifacets that you have. One of the multifacets that you also had in the career was you really had a 360 view of the marketing advertising world. Could we start off with how you got into advertising?
Sure. So I think the thought first came to my head to get into advertising when a friend of mine in high school said, "You know what? I can really see you in advertising." And I was like, huh, yeah, I guess I could too, because I'd always wanted to be a lawyer. And I realized, I'm like, well, that's a lot of school to go to. I got to go to college and I go to law school. I'm like, that seems like quite a bit. And a friend mentioned advertising to me, and I was like, yeah, that kind of sounds right. And I think, a few people listening might, remember the show Who's the Boss, which was a long, long time ago. And Angela Bauer was in advertising. And I was like, oh, that looks pretty cool. Like I kind of wanted to be her. So when I was in college, after my junior year, I got an internship. Actually had two options for an internship. One was in PR and another one was in media, which is, part of the advertising agency world. And I chose media because frankly, that was a paid internship. And I was like, great, I make money and I get an internship at the same time. So once I got into media while I was, before my senior year of college, I never left. And that ended up being the start of my advertising career.
Few things you mentioned that jump out at me: the importance of representation in media. Super interesting. Had you going for 15 years? Was it at the same company? Were you switching companies?
No, definitely not at the same company for 15 years. I started where I started my internship. I think I was there for a few years, and I left because I was working on an account that I just didn't want to work on anymore. And I don't remember, it was a long time ago, but I just kind of felt stuck and I didn't really feel like there was a way out for me within the company. And I think I was just too young to really understand how to navigate kind of getting unstuck within your job. And I felt, well, leaving is the only option. So I interviewed for another role and I got that role, and it was at another agency. And then I was there for about a year or so. And, I moved to North Carolina, where I didn't work for almost 2 years. So, and then when we came back to New York from North Carolina, I got a job at another agency, and I was there for about a year, and that was not a great environment or culture at all. I remember just being in tears, having to go to work every morning and work till midnight every day, and it was just like a horrible experience. So I left, and then I was at another agency where I was actually quite happy. Probably great part of my career, and I was there for about 7 years, and that's a total of 15 years. So that's like four agencies within a span of 15 years. And then I went into consulting. I went to work at Accenture.
Before we go to Accenture, have a few questions on that as well. You first mentioned when you were younger and you felt stuck, you didn't know how to unstick yourself.
Yeah.
Looking back, do you feel there are tips that you would have told your younger self on tactics you could have done?
Oh, absolutely. And I think those are the same tactics that I would use today if I felt in the same way, feeling unstuck. One is to really understand, what is it about my current situation, whether the account that I'm working on or the team that I'm on or a department, what is it that feels, I guess like, what's the issue for me? Then start to talk to either my manager, and if my manager isn't, the type of person that is open to such conversations, and I would just really start to talk to my peers and colleagues, and to really understand if there are other opportunities within the agency or in the department, and then start to talk to HR and really just learn, right? Like really assess and then understand what my options are, and have conversations with the right people, which is a really broad term. But if it's ideally it's your manager, or it's other senior leaders in the organization that I have a good relationship with. And I actually did have a great relationship with many senior folks in the agency, when I could have done that.
I find this super interesting, and it has been repeated with some of our previous guest speakers as well, in a sense that don't just write off a company so fast because it's not always greener on the other side. But you also mentioned something really important, that it's not just your manager, but always make sure that you continue to network within the company across the leadership. That's a super great advice.
Right? Because there are people who are influencing your career decisions on your manager or their manager that you're not really even aware of. And you can get blindsided, especially if you're a very senior person. So it's really having that awareness of who are the people, up and across your organization that have influence on the people who are, actively, in charge of your career path within the company.
Can I ask a tactical question on this? Because this is top of mind right now. How do you first even find who those influencers are? It's not like a mentoring partnership that you're looking for.
No, it's not a mentoring partnership at all. You can directly ask, right? So you can directly ask your manager, especially if you're senior. You can ask your manager, who else is in the room when promotion and reward decisions are being made. Like, who are you having these discussions with? Right? So that's a really good way to find out, one, who's in the room. And then once if you can find out who's in the room, then you can start to really understand or observe, ask around who influences those people, right? It could be someone, as obvious as their EA, right? So
Hmm.
if the EA has a really great relationship with your boss and their boss, that's a person who can influence. I mean, not really a promotion decision, but you know what I mean. It's like who's influencing the people with influence, and who are they going to lunch with? Who are they going to happy hour with? Who are they spending their weekends in the summer with? Or, there's some things can be quite obvious, but other ways it's really just it's politics at the end of the day, right? So
Mm.
who is, kind of like using their currency exchange within a corporate environment.
And once you identify them, what would be your, like, how do you PR yourself? Are you doing like once a month meeting and you share with them everything that you've done, or what's a good tactic there?
That's a great question. And I think that's a really important one because, for one, you do have to PR yourself. And a question that I get asked by a lot of women is, well, I don't really like to brag, or I don't really, what's the reason? I don't want to make it seem so obvious that this feels so self serving. And it's a valid question, it's a valid concern. So that is something to be mindful of. But if there are folks within that influencer board that are part of the organization, you have to look for opportunities, not just, kind of to say hello and hi and build kind of like a semi personal professional relationship with, but how do you keep them updated on things that are happening that would be relevant to them, right? So you have to create the relevance. So if you're working on a really big piece of, business or a client within an agency world, for example, and if something goes really well and there are multiple people involved, sending an email that's just more of an FYI, wanted to share some great positive news. We had a great meeting with the clients, and they shared this feedback. Shout out to the team, and it could be people that report into those senior members that you're really giving that shout out to. So you're doing multiple things in that one email outreach. One, you're giving shout out to junior team members that deserve it, that should be getting the recognition. You're, keeping those senior people informed as to what's happening, especially if it's a big client, and you're leading that narrative. You're the one who's doing that outreach, and people see you as like, oh, wow, great. Bhavana did a great job, and it sounds like everything went well. But you have to find those opportunities to inform and communicate. Because what I found, and this may be your experience as well, that most of the problems start within an organization because of a lack of communication. There's a lot of, kind of like angst almost, like, well, I didn't know that happened. It's like, okay, but it went well or it didn't go well. But the problem isn't the problem. The problem is because somebody didn't know about it. So the more you can do more of the stakeholder management, which is really a skill that I learned when I worked at Accenture. It's a highly matrix organization. And I worked in my own practice where we had our own leaders. We had, a reporting structure for that practice. But the clients that I was working on had a completely different set of stakeholders and leaders for that particular client. So you're really trying to keep like 3 to 4 folks in this matrix organization, updated, and it becomes like a muscle. Like the more you work it, the better it becomes. I would even put a little sticky on my laptop that reminded me when I came back from a meeting or got off a call, who else needs to know about this? Just to kind of remind myself that, like, because you get stuck in your own little world and your own client and your own business, that you forget that there are other people who are interested in how things are going within the work that you're doing.
You also mentioned Accenture a few times, so would love to transition into that next phase in your career. In our pre-call, described Accenture, you mentioned it as your own MBA. It was like getting your MBA but while working, which seems like the best of both worlds. It's also the case that if we look at your career satisfaction graph, you kind of plateaued for a while you were in the advertising world, and then it takes a significant increase when you joined Accenture. What drove you to move from advertising into consulting, and what was sort of that increase in euphoria?
So similar to why I've left other jobs, the reason I decided to leave the agency world and go and do something new, and this is before it was actually like cool to join Accenture. If you went from agency to Accenture, a lot of people looked at me like, what are you doing? That seems like so random and bizarre. But for me, it was, my learning curve plateaued. And I think that's when my career satisfaction graph starts to really level off, is when I don't feel like I'm learning anything new or able to apply any of my infinite wisdom into the work that I'm doing. So I wanted to just go have very different conversation with clients. I, didn't really want to be the subject matter expert anymore. And I wanted to add to my skill set because I felt like there was a lot more to learn and do within the advertising marketing world. So I went over to Accenture. When I was interviewing for my role, I asked my, then manager, what do I get out of this job? Because, and I could ask that question because, it was like, okay, if I don't get this job, like, fine, not a big deal. But at least I can find out, like, what do I get from if I work here after, 2 years? And she said, it's like getting your master's. You'd be getting your, MBA. And for a lot of folks who work in advertising, we don't get our master's because you don't really need one to work in advertising. So after I think 6 months, I was kind of like, wow, this is really boring. Like, I don't like it here. The work itself is quite boring. What am I doing here? Did I make a mistake? And I said, you know what, let's just stick it out for at least a year. I'm sure there's something you can learn. And that was really what kept me going, was what can I learn after, being here? And then after a year, I mean, my learning curve was, I mean, it was steep because there were things that I was learning that I just like never knew how to do, never had learned. But it was really interesting. And even though, companies like Accenture are very process heavy, you have to take a step back, and rather than being frustrated at the process, I really took a step back to understand what's the reason for this process. Like, there's a method to their madness. At the time they had 400,000 employees globally, and you realize, like, you can't just have people do whatever they want. You really need to stick to a schedule, and you need to have a process to keep all of the trains running on time. And and I, when I left after almost, 7 years, I received multiple masters, if a master's existed in agency management. you know um, I could go back and, because I was helping clients, manage their agency relationships. And the other masters I received was, really effective business management and financial management of client engagements. I learned how to pitch and sell. I'd never had to sell anything or have a sales goal when I was on the agency side. So the experience of the pressure of having to hit a number was very real, because your bonus and everything was like dependent on hitting your numbers. So I learned how to, do so many things that I just never would have had the opportunity to do on the agency side.
What was it about that first 6 months that completely changed after a year? Was it just that mental shift that you needed in understanding the process, or what happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the first few months, I was, just to set the context, I was a VP group media director when I was on the agency side, right? Like, I managed multiple pieces of business. I worked directly with marketing clients, senior marketing clients, and I managed teams. Um, so I was, kind of like leading a lot of things. And when I went over to, and it was very strategic, kind of work, right? So it was more planning and strategy rather than the execution part of the business. And when I went to Accenture, it was entirely execution. It was actually post execution. It was understanding what happens to the media buy schedule after it has aired on TV or run on websites, or, and it's doing a lot of it's, very like, it's audit work. And I kind of realized, I'm like, wow, I feel like I just took a step back because I was having these conversations with clients, and now I can't get like a junior person at an agency to call me back. And it just felt, it was kind of like, my ego took a hit in a way. And that's
Mm.
very, true and valid, that I felt like I, took a step back. And I think the turning point was really just, I think as the work continued and developed, and I started to learn more and really change my mindset to say, what can I take away from this? I started to worry less about, the work itself, but rather the what the work was going to teach me.
I love the fact that you address the ego hit, but also focusing on what you can learn to continue to drive and propel your career?
Yeah, that's probably the best move that I made. And at the time, it was a lateral move. And this is something that, again, a lesson learned in my life that I like to share with, with others is sometimes you need to make the lateral move when you feel like you should be getting ahead. Because I was way overdue for a promotion to SVP, but I took this lateral move. And, after 6 years, I was able to really jump ahead over my peers who stayed back on the agency world and able to use my Accenture experience as the kind of conduit to getting my first C-suite role. So sometimes you've got to move sideways to leap ahead.
I do want to also touch on your net worth graph, and particularly it increases during Accenture, but you called out when you were negotiating for the Accenture role the pivotal role that your manager played. It sounded like you kind of undersold yourself and your manager was the one who bumped up the salary. What was that experience?
So, throughout my career, I had never just, you get the job offer and you're super excited and you just take it. Not once did it occur to me that I should have asked for more or that I could even ask for more or there was an opportunity to negotiate. Not once. And it wasn't until that I got to Accenture, I again took the offer that was given to me and, whatever the standard was of the base and the compensation, the bonus structure. The good thing about Accenture is that it is very specific, right? They do have, again, it's a process. So that you're kind of getting the standard stuff. And it wasn't until I want to say 6 months or 8 months into my role that my manager called me and said, "Hey, we're doing a market assessment and see that you are under competitive benchmark. So we're going to up your compensation and it was significant. It was like maybe 20, 30 grand more than what I was making. And I just remember thinking, like, that happens, like this is possible, like all of this time. Because, mind you, I had left an agency where I didn't get a raise for 3 years. And I asked, like, are we getting raises? Was told no, it's a really bad time. So 3 years went by and I hadn't gotten any money. And now, not only did I get a bump when I joined the company, but to get another bump just to be competitive to the marketplace, and which, by the way, didn't even account for my annual raise because of just being good work. And, that put me over a threshold, which was to me at the time was financial freedom. HR, how do I know that I'm being paid competitively to my peers? I know I'm a high performer.
Mm.
I know work harder and do more and I have greater responsibilities. How do I know that I'm getting paid the same? And the answer was you just have to trust your manager. And I had a different manager at that point, but I remember thinking I don't trust my manager. I don't.
Oh.
And I think that was really kind of like the first time I realized, like, am I getting paid less? No, surely not, because I always felt like I was, a high performer, that I was making the most that I could possibly make. And I never even like thought about it. And it wasn't until after I left, Accenture that I was negotiating for a role that was the first time like the how much money could I be making question popped into my head. And I think it was taking all of that Accenture experience and, being more mindful of money that I asked, instead of saying, oh, I'm, adding 10, 20 grand to my base and saying, this is kind of what I expect to make, because that was a question that was asked to me is, what's your number? And I didn't give my number for the very first time. Or I, for the very first time, asked, what's the range being offered for the role? And it was in that, conversation that really, you talk about financial kind of like freedom, it was a 60 to 70% increase off of what I was making. So, there's like a transition that happens. And I think that for the thing to realize for women is there is more to be made if you ask or find out, what is the budget for the job that's being posted? Or if you're already in a job and if you're loyal to a company, that's fantastic, but you're likely making less than people who would get hired into the role. And I get asked a lot, well, how do I know this is competitive to, what? And I just ask the question, hey, I really appreciate this raise or this promotion and the money that comes with it. How does this compare to what, you would be paying someone that would, that you would hire into this role? Because I think that's really the key, is not to just ask or demand for more. This is not about demanding more money. It's making sure you understand what is the pay range being offered for that job, and how do they define the low end and the high end? Is it based on skill set, experience, certifications, number of team members managed, 2 people on the low end, 20 people on the high end? Like, what is that? And make sure that you're being paid fairly and competitively to, your skill set.
The part that really got me thinking was during the pre call, the statistics that you shared about pay equity. You mentioned that when a woman enters a male dominated field, the average pay decreases. And it's the flip if it's the other scenario. Can you share a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's really interesting. As when I started Until They're Nine, or I was kind of doing more research, and I learned about, there's pay equity and then there's equality, right? So it's equality is making sure people are getting paid for the same amount for the same role within a company. Pay, inequity is that women overall tend to make less money than men. And when you look at it by industry or fields, female dominated industries like, healthcare or service workers tend to make less, or teachers, are another great example. Their average pay is lower than male dominated industries. So even like finance and tech, I read that when women start to enter into these fields, the average pay for that, industry starts to decrease. But I think a lot with the pay transparency laws, those are critical, because when you post a range in a job, in a job posting, then, women are more likely to negotiate. So we have to make sure that, as more women get into fields that we want them to be in and they want to be in, like, tech and finance, that, they're making the same money that their male counterparts are making for those same roles. And one way to do that, well, a few ways to do that. One is jobs need to have the range posted in the job descriptions. Women need to understand, how those ranges compare to other companies for similar roles. So, like, there's a lot of homework that needs to be done. Women need to stop saying how much money they're making or provide salary history. A lot of states have that banned, so recruiters can't ask you. But the way recruiters get around that is they ask you, so what's your number? What are you looking for? And that is also a huge mistake, because if you don't know the range being offered and you give your number and it's less, then you're doing yourself a disservice. You're leaving money on the table. So don't give your number. Have a number in mind if you're really pressed for it, but do your homework first. Don't just use your salary history. Instead, ask what's being offered for the role. And the earlier the better in a job interview, because if it's later, it's going to get really awkward. And if it's later and you find out you're close to getting the job, you're too worried about losing that job if you start asking and pressing for about money. So do it early, and make sure you're prepared.
Totally agree. The transparency in the salary range has been a game changer. But at the same time, when I look at LinkedIn, some of these job
Mhm.
postings have an unreasonable range, like
Yeah.
80,000 to 250,000. Would that be a red flag?
So the high ranges in job postings, I've seen that myself. And that's really disheartening, because, I've seen ranges for, 75 to 250. It's like, what? And I think you really have to challenge the recruiter or the HR or the hiring manager, whoever it is, the first conversation. That's why it's better to have that first conversation. Like, hey, I noticed it's a really wide range. Can you help me understand, or can you give me something that's a little bit narrower? Because I don't want to waste my time, and I really don't want to waste your time either. I think there are some companies that are doing it really well where they're posting narrower ranges. So, but yeah, that could be a red flag. I don't want to say it is a red flag because I always like to understand the reason behind it before I decide if it's a red flag or not.
That's fair. I just want to follow up on that question. I think sometimes, and actually, for me, when we are in an interviewing position, I feel a bit vulnerable if I ask these salary questions up front from the fear of what if they sort of mark me as being either stubborn or hard to work with or money driven, which I am. But I feel like there are some hesitations I have in having it at the beginning before I land and know that they want me strongly as well. Any like mental shifts that you can share on being comfortable asking those questions?
So I'll share practical, then kind of go with the emotional. Practical, you could say it's a really broad range. Can we narrow it down just to make sure that we're not wasting each other's time? And if they give you a range of, well, it's really between 1 and 150, then you could say, well, I would definitely be at the higher end of that range, and I would be more, so you can start to kind of like shift it that way, just to have them prepared that you're going to, you're at the higher end or you're going to negotiate if you want to, kind of like set the expectations early on rather than, and this is not about like landing on a specific number. You're right. You don't want to have a negotiation until you really have the interview and understand what's the scope of responsibility, and you don't want to commit to a number beforehand. So that's a great question and a great point, and thanks for allowing me to clarify that. The second part, which is the emotional, is who gives a shit what they think? That's the mindset that is, when I read that, when I first started reading about the pay, inequality, and one of the reasons that women don't ask for more or negotiate is because of, fear or feeling like they would be seen as selfish or greedy or stubborn or difficult. And I remember thinking, well, that's their problem.
Mm.
Why should that hold me back from getting the amount of money that I deserve and frankly is within their budget? And I think the fear, I mean, I have the fear as well. I have the same fears that a lot of other women have, but you have to kind of just get over it in a sense that, if I'm being seen as selfish or greedy for asking for what I deserve, that's a you problem. And there are some companies that see it that way. Do I really want to work there? Like, that's probably not a good environment for you to work in. And maybe it's just the person and not the company, or maybe it is the entire company. But you can't let that fear hold you back from, making significantly more money. I think another stat is women can lose depending on the career, right? And the industry that they're in, they can lose 1 million to 2 million over their career lifetime. So think about that. That it's not just a 20-cent difference in your paycheck between you and your, your white male counterpart. It's up to $2 million over your career lifetime that you are losing out on. That's money that you should be earning today in your paycheck that you can invest into your 401k. You can invest into your own education, your kids' education. More women end up in poverty in their when they're older.
All of these conversations that you're having about equity and whatnot, like what's the mission behind Until There Are Nine?
Um, the mission is to share my own experience in that conversation that I had of, where I got that like 60 to 70% jump, and like, wow, that was crazy. Like, and I was telling a friend of mine about that, and she was like, oh, that's really good. Share that for, save that for me when it's my turn. And it wasn't until I was on that sabbatical that I started to, and I think I just found it recently. It's like a 2-page, 3-page Word document that I started to write that was more of a step-by-step guide for, how do you have those discussions? Like, first of all, know the pay transparency laws. Second of all, make sure you understand, your what's the competitive pay range, and, so on and so forth. And it was really meant to and the verbatims, by the way. I think the most helpful thing that I know my friends would find is how did I state my ask, whether it was verbal or whether it was in an email. And how did I have that discussion? When they asked this, this is how I responded. When they offered this, this is how I responded. And sometimes you can tell women all day long, like, oh, be confident, make sure you negotiate, make sure you ask, go do. But sometimes, like, okay, but how? Like, what are the words that
Mhm.
I say? Or what's the nicest way to, state my ask? So I started to write all of this down, and I realized, well, if I can share this with my friend and she can help someone and I can help someone else that I don't know, like, why not just take the collective experiences of the women who have done it and share it with the women who need help doing it. So the mission of Until There Are Nine is how we can actively help women navigate their kind of career hurdles and in order to achieve pay and promotion equity.
That's what I was thinking. A playbook. It sounds amazing of both the support and accountability system that you're building, of getting more women empowered and into the higher up leadership roles. When you entered C suite, was it all that it was cracked up to be?
um yes and no.
Mm.
And I'll say yes because you have this platform and you realize, like, okay, first it's like, it's surreal. Like, oh my God, I'm here. I'm actually here. I'm
Mm.
finally here. And so, but once you kind of like get over that, you kind of realize, like, okay, I have a really important job in the sense that there are people looking up to me to help solve their problems, right? That I'm not just like another suit who's there and just kind of like in meetings all day and doing kind of like doing things and not actually like helping them. So I took that role very seriously in that I have the influence and power to impact change in people's like day-to-day work life, right? And I took that very seriously. I had a lot of, especially young women looking up to me as being one of them and who had kind of like made it. So in that sense, it was just very like heartwarming to have that experience and knowing that I was in this position. I had this amazing platform to do things like, and the great thing is, and again, I'm a doer, right, by nature. So if I felt like, oh, we need to change something, and I kind of looked around like, oh, I can do that. I have the power to like make that change. So in that sense, it was like further empowering. I think it cracked up to be is like, again, there's parts of the job that are still a job. You're still mired in emails and you're still dealing with, people and politics in this, and then you still have a boss, right? Like people forget that even if you're the CEO, you have a boss and they have a boss and you're still dealing with the same BS as you do if you're like a junior person or in, a mid-level person. So some of those things don't really go away. But I would say more so yes than no.
I love it. It's very inspirational, to be honest. And in that inspiration, I mentioned before we started the call, there was one question I was dying to ask you since our pre call. And that is, for anyone that is desiring or have the ambitions of reaching that level, like, is it just a matter of following a playbook?
No, I don't think anyone can get to it if they set their mind to it, because I can set my mind to a lot of things, but you actually have to. There's a lot of, there's two forces at play if you're trying to get to the C suite. The one force is absolutely yourself, right? And I have 5 things that I tell women they need to be doing if you want to, manage, like, how can you like take care of yourself, like mind your own business, right? And the second part is what your company, what your managers need to be doing to help bring more women and honestly also like people of color along into leadership roles. So it's not like, oh, there's only 1 in 4 leadership roles that are women. It's not the women's fault. That's not a problem for women to fix. And that's,
Mm.
it's really a problem for companies and managers to fix. The individual can do, a handful of things, and those are, work to the goal, right? So there was an earlier podcast that I listened to, which said, what's the goal that you have in 5 years, and make sure that you are actively working towards that. So if there's training, if there's learning, if you need to do, take a finance course, whatever it is, because if you want to be CMO, that's what you have to do. The second is you have to set goals that matter. And I think this is critical, because you can set all the goals you want, but if you're not talking to your manager and saying, are these goals getting me promoted? Are these goals helping me achieve my 5 year, 10-year plan of, I do want to be a CMO, I do want to be a COO? Are these the goals that are going to help me get there? Right? It can't just be like, I'm going to do a great job on this one client. What are the goals that actually make a difference in getting you to the C-suite? The third is make sure that you are capturing and communicating your quantifiable value. So you don't just come in and do work day in and day out. What are you actually producing? And there has to be a number, a dollar sign, or a percentage that you can attach to at least 2 to 3 of your contributions that you're making in the workplace. You're either helping company make money or save money. That's what they care about. What can
Mm.
you come up with to help showcase that? The fourth is you have to get a sponsor. You have to be sponsorable, right? And that means you have someone senior and high level enough in a company that sees you, that sees that you're a star, and that brings you for those high profile projects that will get you noticed and bring you further along in your career. And then last, and we already talked about this, is owning your narrative, right? Your PR plan, and making sure you know your influencer board. For companies, there's a few things that they can do, but I think the most important is, how are they actually helping women advance from the junior level to the mid level to the senior level? Because research shows that there is a significant drop off between junior to mid and then mid to senior. Women make up 50% of the workforce early in their careers in an organization or an industry, but then we're only 25% when it comes to leadership roles. There's a, what is called a leaky bucket problem or a broken rung problem, right? It's not a glass ceiling issue. It's a broken rung issue. So there are strategies that managers and companies should be, putting in place to fix that problem. Without that, and I think one of them is succession planning, right? So if you're not purposely doing succession planning at your company, even, every manager should be asked, who's your successor, right? Because if you're not building your successors, what are you doing? Every job is temporary. Who are you going to take, and who are you grooming to fill your role? And I think that's where I think a lot of, women can be helped in, especially at the more senior level, is, how are we helping women fill the roles that we are going to vacate at some point?
Love it. Love it. This has been fantastic, Bhavna. For folks who would love to learn more about the work that you're doing, what's the best place to find you?
Untilthey're9.com.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. It was a great conversation.